Hi everyone, welcome to PARP 6150, the Book of Nature. This is our first lecture of the semester, so rather than waste any time, let's dive in and get started. Contemporary discourse often argues that the deep cultural roots of our present ecological malaise lie in something like the bifurcation of nature, the ontological and epistemological severance of culture from nature, of the human from all that lives, moves, grows, flies, crawls, swims, shines, or has its being apart from properly human agency. We might also call this alienation, the psychological, cultural, political, and imaginative situation in which we find ourselves increasingly distanced both from nature and from primal experiences of reality. But while we lament this divide when thinking about ecology within the modern West, our key cultural institutions reinscribe it constantly, sometimes consciously, but often and perhaps even more fatefully at the level of the unconscious. Indeed, the problem is so deep that even many of our best efforts at environmental action, however needful in the short term, prove unsustainable in the long term precisely because they perpetuate this deep tendency to bifurcate the world and so separate us from it, leading inexorably, as Heidegger argued, to further objectification and commodification. And one of the big questions I want to ask with you throughout this course is, are we, as Heidegger thought, destined tragically for such exploitation both of the earth and of ourselves? Close philosophical, theological, and critical attention to pre-modern traditions, even in the West, suggests otherwise. And one of the most powerful sites for such renewed attention is the ancient metaphor of the world as itself discursive, the prose and poetry of the world, the book of nature, or the Liber Naturae. Until its early modern transposition into the language of mathematics, the Liber Naturae tradition formed the dominant approach to the interpretation of nature and creation in the West. Arguably, this hermeneutical approach to creation has the powerful effect of unsettling the very dualisms between nature and culture that have become so problematic within the contemporary world. For if the world is indeed saturated with intelligibility, if it is written as a divine text, the product of a divine culture, then it cannot be poor in meaning when compared with our human products. Rather than a standing reserve, as Heidegger described nature according to the modern world picture, the world must instead be saturated with a deeper and so partly hidden meaning, one that requires participation more than mere manipulation, understanding more than mastery, and empathy and kinship more than objectification. Now, it may be that other cultures, whether the traditional ecological knowledges of indigenous peoples or certain non-dual traditions of Asia and elsewhere, these other cultures might have better preserved such approaches than the West. But it was the West that unleashed and exported the conceptual and technological engines now remaking the face of the earth. And arguably, it is we who have most jeopardized our ability to hear from the world. As Thomas Berry writes in the great work, we are talking only to ourselves. We are not talking to the rivers. We are not listening to the wind and the stars. We have broken the great conversation. By breaking that conversation, we have shattered the universe. All the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual breaking. Jung himself recognized something similar, a loss of emotional participation with nature that seemed to mark the modern West especially. Modern human beings, Jung writes, the modern human feels himself isolated in the cosmos. He is no longer involved in nature and has lost his emotional participation in natural events, which hitherto had a symbolic meaning for him. Thunder is no longer the voice of a god, nor is lightning his avenging missile. No river contains a spirit, no tree means a man's life, no snake is the embodiment of wisdom, and no mountain still harbors a great demon. Neither do things speak to him, nor can he speak to things like stones, springs, plants, and animals. He no longer has a bush soul, identifying him with a wild animal. His immediate communication with nature is gone forever, and the emotional energy it generated has sunk into the unconscious. So, if there are inflection points within our history, I have in mind something like collective meridians or cultural acupressure points. If there are inflexible pressure points within our history that we can press to change how we understand ourselves and relate to the more than human worlds in which we dwell and commune, then I want to know what those are. I think the Book of Nature is one of those points. It's a profoundly endearing metaphor in all of its very guises. People use it all the time without a second thought. We read the stories within rocks, or the universe story, as Brian Swim narrates it, or the language of DNA, or the meaning in the sunset, the night sky, and so forth. I'm sure you can think of many, many more iterations of the metaphor. Or think of this. I'm outside right now, and around me there are some plants growing around me. There's some rocks over there, and a redwood tree, and some oaks. If I were to try to describe the redwoods, I might describe the width of the trunk, 4 or 5 feet in diameter, their silent, brooding presence, the dense mat redwood needles, the dense mat that redwood needles create when they fall on the ground, or the way the lower needles are broad and long to breathe cool air below on a foggy morning, while short, narrow needles, more like a juniper or a cedar, grow high above, out of the bark to catch the sunlight. I could tell you that the redwood tree is called Sequoia sempervivens, which is Latin for evergreen, always living, ever flourishing. Now, I'm saying all of these words about the redwood tree. It's not the redwood tree itself that's speaking, but in another sense, these words that I'm speaking are given to me by the redwood. They're put forth through me when I tend to the redwood and bring certain qualities and skills of my own to it. I know a bit of Latin. I pay attention to the tree. I look at the I look at the needles and so forth. How does a tree find its way into language? How does it put forth words through me? These are also questions raised by the idea of the book of nature. It's a powerful metaphor, not least because it's so endearing. So let's pull it apart for a second. The idea or the metaphor of the book of nature seems simple enough. Nature is somehow described as a book, but there's a tremendous amount of complexity and depth in the metaphor. To begin with, the idea of nature is itself vast and enormously complicated. The critical theorist Raymond Williams says nature is perhaps the most complex word in the language, and he adds, any full history of the uses of nature would be a history of a large part of human thought. For Williams, nature was what he called a keyword, that is, ordinary, enduring words that profoundly shape the way we perceive the world and act within it. Keywords last, but they also change their meanings over time. Through their connection with other concepts and words and their interaction with changing historical, economic, political, and even ecological circumstances, keywords and the worlds they half reveal, half construct, transform over time. Part of what we'll think about in this course is nature and what we mean by it. But then you add books to the mix and you get something new. The idea of communicability, interpretation, expressions, guidance, truth-telling, meaning, secrets, hermeneutics, and all the mysteries that the humanities at their best have devoted themselves to cultivating. Simone Weil has a marvelous essay on the concept of reading. She begins by drawing a distinction, one that we can all easily recognize, between sensation and thinking. Sensation, she writes, is immediate, a brute fact that it sees, and that it seizes us by surprise. Without warning, a man is punched in the stomach. Everything changes for him before he knows what has happened. I touch something hot and I jerk my hand back before I even know that I burned myself. Something seizes me here. It is the universe, and I recognize it by the way it treats me. The mind has no part in it except insofar as it is subject to it. Our thoughts, on the other hand, she explains, arise differently. They feel as if they're ours. They come, as it were, from within. Reading, however, is the name for a mystery that subverts this all too simple distinction between sensing and thinking. The mystery, Vey explains, is that there are sensations that are pretty much insignificant in themselves, yet by what they signify, what they mean, they seize us in the same way as the stronger sensations. There are some black marks on a sheet of white paper, she continues. They couldn't differ more from a punch in the stomach, yet they can have the same effect. So she gives the example of two mothers, each receiving a letter with news that her son has died. Presumably Way has in mind the world wars that she lived through. So the first mother is shattered, the other's unfazed. Why? Because, Way says, the second mother cannot read. It isn't the sensation, it is the meaning that has seized the first woman by striking her mind immediately as a brute fact without her participation in the matter. Just the way that sensations strike us, everything happens as if the pain were in the letter itself and jumped out from the letter to land on the face reading it. With respect to the actual sensations themselves, the color of the paper, the ink, they do not even come to mind. It is the pain that is given to one's sight. In just this way, she insists, at each instant of our life, we are gripped from the outside, as it were, by meanings that we ourselves read in appearances. The sky, the sea, the sun, the stars, human beings, everything that surrounds us is in the same way something we read. Now, if we take Simone Weil's account of reading seriously, then we can utter another mystery. Once there was no writing, only reading. Humans read before they learned to write, and they could only begin writing because they were already readers. But what they read wasn't a book or a text or a script, but the world. Only later did we learn to call the world a book by analogy, but to call the world a book was natural because the capacity to read the world is aboriginal to what it means to be human. If Raymond Williams sees nature as a keyword, Hans Blumenberg considers the book of nature, or the legibility of the world, to be an example of what he calls absolute metaphors. Metaphors so fundamental to the way we think or do philosophy that they cannot be simply logicized or translated into prose. At the base of our imagination, as it were, they organize and regulate whole swaths of epical attitudes, convictions, sentiments, preconceptions, and even perceptions about the world, the human place in the world, and the god or gods or powers that govern the world and make it to be. The metaphor of the book of nature seems to have that quality to it. It goes deep in us, so there is something very powerful in bringing it to reflexive articulation, not by collapsing the metaphor into logic, but by looking at how it works and how it has worked. For that reason, our approach throughout this course will be historical, hermeneutical, and contemplative. To understand how the book of nature has shaped us and how it might still shape us for good and for ill, we need to look at its history, and we need to bring both critical and charitable capacities for interpretation. But I also think we need to bring a certain contemplative openness. Maybe you'd even want to go further and bring in some, and I'm inviting you throughout this course to go even further and to bring in some contemplative practices that Ashton and I already discussed a little bit in our dialogue, and you'll be hearing more about throughout this course. This is a key point, actually. Pre-modern approaches to the book of nature were largely what we would call nowadays contemplative. Pre-modern people held books in higher esteem than we do. They were scarce, expensive, even revered. And when the book of nature metaphor first begins to appear, it does so in the context where writing and books have a sacred character. They're in the hands of a priestly caste, and they become the medium of religious people. In other words, nature wasn't just any book. It certainly wasn't what we mean by referring to a text. Nature was akin to a sacred text. From its earliest iterations through even to much of its use today, a good deal of the power of the book of nature metaphor lies in the way it expresses the entwined relationship between interpretive strategies for understanding sacred texts and those for making sense of what we can recognize as a sacred nature. Earliest occurrences of the book of nature metaphor first start to appear thousands of years ago. The metaphor seemed to have presented itself to human minds or shaped the development of human minds almost as soon as literacy commenced. In ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, the stars in the night sky were regarded as a heavenly writing, impressed upon the great tablet of the sky. This eternal celestial script, besides being revered, was also to be imitated in temples that were created to reflect the heavens and to be as beautiful and enduring as the stars, thereby acquiring some of that majesty for earthly kingdoms. Here, the connection between a script and a law with its power to govern is an important one. But the script was not only to be emulated, it was also to be interpreted. After all, if there is indeed a writing in the sky, then this suggests that it is something that can be read, even if only in part, as Shakespeare's soothsayer says in Antony and Cleopatra, in nature's infinite book of secrecy, a little can I read. The script in the sky wrote the fortunes of men and women, and so the ability to read it, even if only in part, was bound up with ancient and antique astrology and divination. Beginning in Mesopotamia and then spreading through successive cultural and imperial lines of transmission, divinatory readings of the sky spread throughout antiquity. But divination wasn't the whole of the book metaphor. The sky, rightly read, spoke of changes in the weather, the progression of the seasons, and the marking of time, including ritual time. Nor did the divine script, once recognized, remain above in the celestial sphere alone. The semiotic quality of the sky could and did migrate to things below, even to all things. So in the middle of the 1st century CE, in his defense of Greek astrology, the Stoic philosopher Seneca writes about the divinatory quality of lightning. Lightning foretells future events and gives signs with far more obvious and clearer marks of evidence than if these were in writing. Seneca likewise defends augury, the Roman practice of reading omens and the behavior of birds, because as Seneca affirms, all things occur in accord with fate. For Seneca, at least, there's a difference between the stars, which are signs because they are also powers that influence the fates of mortals, and omens, like lightning or the flight of birds, which merely display what is to be. But you didn't have to buy into Stoic fatalism in the antique world to accept the idea that a deeper, even cosmic meaning can be read within the events and creatures of this world. Plotinus, for example, despite his criticism of antique astrology, nevertheless acknowledges that the stars are like letters always being written in heaven, or rather always written and set in motion. But, he adds, this is only because all things are bound up with one another. The stars can be read, but so too can the flight of birds or the face of a human being. All things are connected and intelligible and communicative because all things issue from a single united breath, a single principle, the soul of the world that makes the universe to be one rather than just merely many. This cosmic sympathy means that the universe is semiotic through and through. Indeed, for Plotinus, wisdom is bound up with the capacity to read the world in precisely this way. Everything is full of signs, he writes, and the one who understands one thing on the basis of another is a wise man of sorts. Plotinus' argument is that the things of this world, from the celestial bodies above the sphere of the moon to the sublunary beings and events below, all of these can signify, all of these are intelligible, without thereby becoming deterministic causes in the manner that Seneca read them. Borrowing Jung's language, you might say that Plotinus is arguing that all things are legible because they are shot through with an acausal connecting principle. Now, for this module, I've asked you to read a little bit of Plotinus, but also some short biblical excerpts, since it is far more in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic worlds where the book of nature metaphor is felt most powerfully. Greek writers use it more casually, and with the exception of Plato's Timaeus, they rarely theorize about it. This is probably because there's no single sacred text within classical and Hellenistic pagan Greek culture, so there's no privileged text, sacred text, to which nature as a unity is compared. But within the Abrahamic traditions, there were such writings, collected together in volumes taken to be the very word of God, a book, the Bible. Within this book, there are passages that actually suggest familiarity with the metaphor of the heavenly script. But biblical writers deploy this image to somewhat different ends. In the first chapter of Genesis, lights are set in the dome of the sky as signs, not because they govern fate, but rather for seasons and the marking of the days. Where Mesopotamian texts imagine the sky as a tablet engraved with the language of the stars, their power and their connection to fate, bound up with their immutability, the biblical texts see the sky pointing beyond itself to the God who alone sustains it and all things in being. In an apocalyptic vein, the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, chapter 34, declares, "All the hosts of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll." You see that? The sky is a scroll, but it will pass away. The heavenly powers may control something of the fates of those of us in the sublunary realm, but these powers are neither eternal nor omnipotent. No matter how large they seem, they are not imperial, inescapable, cosmic powers to which we're subject, but creatures, like all things, save God. Centuries later, the early Christian prophet John, the author of the book of Revelation, will use the same image in his own apocalypse. In Revelation chapter 6, John writes, "The sky vanished like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place." You can see a similar theological motif in Peter's description of the day of the Lord, 2 Peter chapter 3, when the elements, the stoicheia, will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed. The word stoicheia originally designated letters of the alphabet, but Plato's Timaeus had centuries before employed the language of Stoicheia to speak of the four elements of classical physics: earth, air, fire, and water. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, Justin Martyr still uses the word to speak of the sun, moon, and stars. So what Peter is saying is that the letters, the alphabet, the writing of the sky, the Stoicheia, will come to an end. In these various passages, we encounter a biblical acknowledgement both of the celestial writing and of its non-ultimacy. There is, to be sure, a displacement of the gods of the nations in much of this, but not for all of that a disenchantment of the world. For the biblical writers, the world cannot be taken to be ultimate. To think otherwise is idolatry. But for the biblical authors, the world is still a sacred place, a kind of temple filled with beings, visible and invisible, a creation constantly porous to the presence of God. These are themes you can find already in the earliest chapter of Genesis. The background of Genesis is the ancient Near East, especially the Mesopotamian culture of Babylon. Scholars often read Genesis alongside the Babylonian creation story known as the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish tells the tale of the creation of the world. In the beginning, there was only Apsu and Tiamat, the male and the female, the primordial seas, the ancient gods of the deep. Eventually, they merged their waters and gave birth to other gods who plotted conquest and sought to destroy their parents. Divining this, Apsu sought to destroy them first. Here you can think of Kronos devouring his children. But the new gods wage war against him, and Apsu is killed. Enraged, Tiamat turns herself into a great dragon and seeks to avenge herself against her husband's murderers. But she in turn is killed by the storm god Marduk, the god of Babylon, who severs her carcass in two to create the universe. Half of her corpse becomes the sky and the heavenly bodies, the other half the earth. And then humans are created essentially as servants or slaves of the gods. The myth ends with a celebration of Marduk. The similar accounts of creation as a kind of cosmic battle are found throughout other ancient Near Eastern religions, and the book of Genesis, too, echoes many of these themes in the Enuma Elish. For example, in both Genesis and the Babylonian myth, creation is about ordering the cosmos, setting bounds, dividing the waters, and making sure that each creature has a habitat suitable for it, a place where it belongs. But Genesis also differs in notable ways. Where Marduk creates with violence, the god of Genesis creates with a call and a response. Let it be. A word spoken that brings order without violence. There's no cosmic corpse, no originary murder, just creation called into being and called good. The material of creation, the stuff out of which it's made, is not the slain body of Tiamat, but rather the Ruach of God. The Spirit broods over the waters and brings life into all creation. In the Enuma Elish, the celestial bodies, sun, moon, stars, and fertility itself, are worshipped as divine. But in Genesis, these are themselves creatures, the greater and lesser lights, not gods to which humans submit. And humans are not created from the blood of a slain and monstrous deity, but are rather made in God's image. They are not servile, not made to be slaves, but image bearers, one and all, which includes connotations of royalty and priesthood. In one sense, the Genesis account dethrones the gods of the ancient Near East. But we need to be careful not to read this demythologization as a disenchantment of the world. For the biblical authors, the world is still a sacred and a wonderful place, filled with beings visible and invisible, porous, as I said, to the presence of God. Recent exegetes have noted how thoroughly the Genesis account parallels ancient Near Eastern narratives of temple construction. In Isaiah 66, for example, God asks, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me, and what is my resting place?" The opening chapters of Genesis seem to provide an answer. God's temple is not built with human hands. God's temple, the divine temple, is the cosmos. Where will God's resting place be? Well, where else but the Sabbath, the seventh day, the day of rest, when the good things of creation are offered back to God with thanksgiving by the human being, his own created image, that God had set in the center of the cosmic temple. And, despite the contrast with the Mesopotamian texts, for the biblical writers, the skies can still speak. So the psalmist writes, "The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." An even more salient precursor of the Book of Nature motif is found in the parallel some later Jewish exegetes discerned between the world and the law. In his commentary on the creation of the world, for instance, Philo of Alexandria lived around the time of Christ, from 20 BCE through to about 50 in the Common Era. Philo reads creation in tandem with the Mosaic Law. He commends Moses for opening Genesis with neither a mere legal catalog nor a fantastic series of invented or received mythologies. Instead, he notes, the opening chapters of Genesis engage the reader's admiration because they connect the created world in which we dwell to the revealed law by which we live. Here's how he puts it. Moses' exordium, the opening chapters of Genesis, is one that excites our admiration in the highest degree, says Philo. It consists of an account of the creation of the world, implying that the world is in harmony with the law, and the law with the world, and that the man who observes the law is constituted thereby a loyal citizen of the world, regulating his doings by the purpose and will of nature, in accordance with which the entire world itself is also administered. It fell, however, to early Christian writers, some of whom we'll encounter in coming modules, to fully develop the notion of the world as text, what eventually came to be known as the Book of Nature. We'll turn to some of these figures in great detail over the coming weeks. But for now, let me try to sum it up this way. While the New Testament does not use such language explicitly, it never says the Book of Nature, the prologue to the Gospel of John and some of the writings of Paul give a lot of material that would eventually be molded into this concept. In the prologue to the Gospel of John, especially its use of the Greek term logos as a name for the second person, for the Son of God, for Christ. The equation of God, the Son of God, the Incarnate One, and the Logos performs a powerful fusing of cultural traditions that buoys a lot of reflection about the Book of Nature. Here's how John puts it in his opening chapter, John 1. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, ente arche ein ho logos." In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos, the Word, was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now, the power of these brief opening verses lies in the way they echo the opening lines of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's an echo of that there, but also there's this extraordinary interpolation of the Greek word logos into the heart of the Christian story. So you have the Hebrew and the Greek inheritance sort of merging right in this powerful opening passage. A crucial philosophical term of art in Hellenic philosophy, logos, conveys an almost untranslatable semantic fullness. It can be variously rendered as word, the verbum in Latin, as reason, ratio, or principle, principium, even all three at once, and it includes connotations of meaning, communicability, intelligibility, order, even beauty. John's prologue adds to this semantic history the identification of the Logos with the Son of God and with the work of both creation and salvation. So everything then becomes Logos filled and Logos ordered. Similar elements are found throughout the Pauline epistles. That's the letters of St. Paul that follow the Gospels in the Christian New Testament, as well, especially in, so similar themes appear in Paul's letters, maybe most especially in the opening chapter of his letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Paul writes, "Ever since the exaltation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things that God has made." For St. Paul, as for St. John, this creational witness has been overshadowed. Paul says their senseless minds were darkened because of sin, such that now people know only in part and see, as it were, through a mirror in a riddle, per speculum enigmate, as the Latin Vulgate puts it, rendering 1 Corinthians 13. The idea, the picture being drawn is of a world encountered through a complex and sometimes shadowy tissue of meanings and symbols that can only rightly be understood through the transformation of capacities for discernment and for the renewal of minds, as Christians were brought into conformity with Christ. The horizon for such transformation is eschatological, meaning it's the end of the world, the consummation of all things. But the process of this transformation begins here and now as one learns, among other things, how appropriately to read the meaning of the world. And how does one read the meaning of the world? Well, in the same way that one learns to read the scriptures, which is to say, as Paul puts it, spiritually, pneumatikos, allegorically, allegorumena, or typologically, tupikos. The church fathers learned from the New Testament to read the Old allegorically, to discover within the Hebrew scriptures meanings that went beyond those available merely on the surface. Hellenic authors employed allegoresis in order to derive moral and philosophical lessons from what might otherwise seem embarrassing mythological and poetic narratives, while Jewish exegetes like Philo of Alexandria employed similar reading strategies, now supplemented and deepened by the theological warrant of revelation. Patristic Christian authors, having learned from Philo, but even more from the New Testament, rooted their allegorical practices less in hermeneutical theory than in Christological conviction, that is, their belief in the person of Christ. For these early Christians, to confess the lordship of Christ is to encounter the scriptures anew. Indeed, writes St. Paul in 2 Corinthians 3, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their mind, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed, and all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. The scriptures were to be read mystically, in other words, which is very different both from modern fundamentalist approaches to the Bible and from modern historical critical methods for studying the scriptures. In the same way, the book of nature was to be read mystically, because it too issues from a fullness of inexhaustible meaning, and so requires a kind of contemplative rather than calculative gaze to be understood. And this is different, maybe even more different from modern reductionist objectifying approaches to nature, as this is as different, and maybe even more different from modern reductionist objectifying approaches to nature, as their method for reading scripture is from deracinated modern approaches. In coming modules, we'll try to make more sense of all this and ask whether there are aspects of it that live on or might be retrieved even in our modern, postmodern, meta-modern, or whatever you want to call our times. In the meantime, I've given you a lot to think about. I've asked you to read some texts, and I really look forward to thinking through it all with you in the discussion.